I appreciate the invitation to share with you a little bit about the Southern Emigrant Trail that's captured all of our imaginations. In particular, as Doug mentioned, the beginning of the trail that started out of Memphis. I'm going to be talking mostly about the Butterfield Overland Mail across Arkansas, and my interest in this subject began about 8 years ago when I was working with my postage stamp collection. My wife and I had come to Tucson. She was at the gym show, and I was visiting at the Postal Foundation there in Tucson, and I met a fellow named John Birkenbein. He was looking through my collection, and when he got to 1859, he saw this envelope in my collection, and he said, "Oh, you have a Butterfield cover." And I said, "What's a Butterfield cover?" And he went on to explain to me the story of John Butterfield and the Butterfield Overland Mail. He shared with me the route through Arkansas, and I discovered that I lived within 1,000 feet of the Butterfield stage route and had moved several times in Arkansas, but every time was within a few hundred feet of the Stagecoach route. And so I began to focus my stamp collection on collecting more Butterfield covers and letters such as these for my collection. This letter, written in 1860 by James Manter, he wrote it on May 30, 1860 at Copper Mills, California. It was carried to the Strawberry Valley Post Office on June 1st, and since the distance to Maine was over 3,000 miles, it required a 10-cent stamp. Based on its postmark, it departed San Francisco on the Butterfield stage at 8 o'clock on Thursday, June 17th, and that stage was scheduled to arrive in Missouri at 10:30 on July 1st, where it was transferred to a train for the rest of its journey to its destination. And this letter from my collection, written by John Simpson to T.C. Simpson, it was carried to the Austin, Texas Post Office on December 18, 1860. And since it was transcontinental mail, it was carried from Austin, Texas, north to Fort Belknap to meet the Butterfield Overland Mail stage. The stage left there and went into Missouri. The original terminus was at Tipton, but the train had been extended a few more miles to Syracuse. And so the Butterfield stage stopped at Syracuse, where this letter was transferred to a train to continue on its journey to Morristown, Pennsylvania. In that same conversation about 8 years ago, it led me to begin to research the Butterfield Overland Mail, and resulted in the publication of these 3 books in the last 2 years, the results of my 8 years of study. So let me begin with just a brief introduction about why the Butterfield Overland Mail Company even existed. And the reason for it starts in 1848 when gold was discovered out west. The discovery of gold and the migration of folks beginning in 1859, thousands of Americans came this way in order to find gold in hopes of finding a fortune for their families back home. And it was mostly men who came out west, leaving the women to care for the farm back home. And the only means of communicating back home to the family was by mailing a letter. The gold rush resulted in thousands of families attempting to send mail to and from the California gold fields. Now back then, mail delivery was different. Mail delivery as we know it today, with a mail carrier stopping at every mailbox in the country 5-6 days a week, did not begin until 1902 and didn't really reach Arkansas till 1915. Prior to 1915 in Arkansas, you had to physically go to the post office and ask the postmaster if you had any mail. And the postman was likely to say, "Oh, here's a letter for Harold. Could you drop it off to him on your way home?" That's how mail was distributed. If you didn't go to the post office and pick your letter up, the postman was required to publish in the newspaper a list of names of letters that were waiting. And if you got to that point, when you finally picked up your mail, you had to pay a couple pennies extra because it had to be advertised for you to come and get it. So mail delivery in Arkansas was very rustic at this point. If you wanted to send a letter back home, you would find some merchant or trapper or wagon train that was headed back east to the families, and you would give that stranger your letter along with a few coins in hopes that when they reached Jackson or Memphis or Lexington or Paducah or St. Louis, they would go by a post office and drop off your letter along with a few coins. Arkansans would frequently send multiple copies of the same letter in hopes that one of them might arrive. This letter from my collection was written by Aaron Lyon, eventually the founder of Lyon College in Arkansas, and it was the second copy of the letter that he sent to New York. This was common practice. This picture of gold miners gathered around a letter indicates the importance of letters and mail to the gold miners. One of them wrote, a 49er wrote, "If you could have seen us when we received our letters, you would have laughed and perhaps called us fools. There was such hurrahs and jumping and yelling and screaming. Now you take good care to write often when I tell you that I live upon your letters," with a small sprinkling of pork and bread on the side. So, prior to Butterfield Overland Mail, prior to 1858, you had three ways to get mail to California. You could give your mail to some wagon train that was headed to California in hopes that they would eventually get that mail into the post office in California and it would eventually find its way to your loved one. Or you could place your letter in the mail service, and that mail would be taken to New Orleans or New York, and it was twice a month. A ship would leave south. It would either go around the tail end of South America and on to California, or to Panama, where it was transferred to a train and then to another ship up the coast. Those were the three ways to get a letter to California. It was also the three ways to get to California. You either went across the Southern Emigrant Trail or you went by ship, one of those two routes. In the 1850s, pressure from California on the federal government to formalize a mail delivery service brought about a contract for this to happen. The mail would leave twice a week, not twice a month, and it would be delivered in less than 25 days to San Francisco. The federal government did this. It was going to cost $600,000 a year. They did it for three reasons. First of all, to help families communicate with loved ones in the gold rush camps. But secondly, to strengthen ties with California. California had only been a state since 1850, and there was concern that they wanted it to be connected to the Union, stronger connection with the Union. And third, by establishing a station every 15 to 20 miles from what they considered civilization out to California, it would provide a safer passageway for the thousands of folks who were traveling by horseback or by foot or by wagon coming west on their own. So the contract went out. John Butterfield was one of the bidders, and he was selected. He lived in New York near Gerald. They were friends, and John Butterfield got the contract. He was a wealthy stagecoach operator in New York. He knew his business, and so he was selected $600,000 a year if he could deliver the mail twice a week in less than 25 days. The first thing John Butterfield had to do is to establish the route. First of all, how do you get from St. Louis and Memphis down toward the Southern Emigrant Trail? There were no Interstate 40s. There were just animal paths in Arkansas. By the 1800s, many of these animal paths had become a little more established, but they still were not wide enough to carry a wagon. They had been improved, but not enough. It was in 1824 when the federal government called for surveys and road improvements to be made across the state of Arkansas, from Memphis to Fort Smith and on up into Indian Territory to Fort Gibson. In 1826, construction began. Lieutenant Frederick L. Griffith was appointed superintendent, and these were the specs for the road. Beginning in January 27, 1826, he was to make a road at least 24 feet wide throughout, with all timber and brush removed and stumps cut as low as possible, marshes and swamps to be causewayed with poles or split timber, and ditches 4 feet wide and 3 feet deep to be dug on either side of the road. Large trees had to be cut to be only 12 inches from the ground, still low enough to not snag the bottom of a wagon. And so beginning in 1826, as this construction began across Arkansas, these military roads eventually became the road across the state. And here you see a segment of the military road. It's 24 feet wide, drainage ditches on each side. And the Butterfield Overland Mail Company was able to take advantage of these military roads that existed on a great part of the path across the state of Arkansas. In the Delta, unlike Arizona, water, mud, 365 is a problem. Deep mud. And so split logs or planks were laid down side by side to provide a solid, although bumpy, route across soft spots. In fact, even in the 1930s, this plank bridge carried folks into Arkansas across the Great Swamp. So following the military road for the most part, Butterfield selected the route across the state of Arkansas to get to Fort Smith. Twice a week, the stage was going to leave St. Louis. A second stage would leave Memphis. They would join up in Fort Smith and then head toward the Southern Emigrant Trail. And at the same hour, Stagecoach would leave San Francisco, headed to Fort Smith. At Fort Smith, it would then split. Some passengers and some mail headed toward San Francisco. Other passengers, other mail headed to Memphis. Originally, the route in Arkansas bypassed the state capital of Little Rock, but a month or two later, the route was changed to include Little Rock. So by September of 1858, the route was fixed. Over 3,000 miles, including about 322 miles from Memphis to Fort Smith, 139 stations organized along the route, later increased to 175 stations. He purchased, according to Gerald, 34 stagecoaches and 66 lighter weight celerity wagons. And he hired hundreds of drivers and conductors and station keepers and blacksmiths, mechanics, wheelwrights, helpers, herders, veterinarians, armed guards, harness makers, and scattered these employees all along the route. John Butterfield had a great idea for Arkansas, to carry the mail from Fort Smith to Memphis. There's the Arkansas River and the Mississippi River. So he bought a steamboat called the Jenny Whipple, and that's what he was going to use and not have to set up any stations across the state of Arkansas. But in September of 1858, the Arkansas River wasn't cooperating. The water was so low, it was impossible for his steamboat to make that trip. And so he hastily contracted with an existing stagecoach route in Arkansas, the John Chittister Stage Line, to carry the overland mail and passengers across the state of Arkansas. No financial records or contracts from that arrangement have survived. At the Chittister Museum, they have preserved John Chittister's house, but as far as they know, in the 1960s, a well-meaning family member cleaned out the attic and cleaned out the office and all of those ledgers are gone. And so we do not know if the purchase of the Jenny Whipple or this contract with John Chittister proved to be financially profitable for John Butterfield. These were the mail routes that Chittister already had across the state of Arkansas, and this one right across the middle from Red Arrow to Red Arrow, that's the one that John Butterfield needed, the mail route from Memphis to Fort Smith. So starting in September of 1858, the first overland mail from Memphis and St. Louis passed through Arkansas to merge at Fort Smith. The very first part of the route out of St. Louis and out of Memphis were by train. In Memphis, passengers took a ferry across the Mississippi River to Hopefield, Arkansas, and then boarded a train for 24 miles. There they switched to a wagon. In St. Louis, they boarded a train to Tipton, about 169 miles, if I remember right, and there it was transferred to a stagecoach. Coming out of West Memphis, again, the Great Swamp, much of the track had to be on trestles to get over the swamp. But even after that, creeks galore. Many of them, primitive bridges were built, but on the great part of them, the stagecoach just forded across. Near my home at Palarm Creek, 60 feet wide, but the stagecoach just forded right across the creek. And in larger streams, such as the Arkansas River at Fort Smith to Van Buren, there were large mud flats. And so it was not unusual at 2 o'clock in the morning when the stage arrived at Van Buren for a horseback rider with a lantern to lead the stagecoach across the mud flats into Fort Smith. When crossing some of the creeks at Cadron or the White River, at Des Arc or at Van Buren, a ferry was in place, something like this one, to carry the Butterfield stage across. Today, there's a number of segments of the Butterfield Road that still exist. This section is by my home near the Cadron Ferry site. Here's another piece that's by my home headed toward Plummer Station. Here's another piece and another one. This is by Pot Station. Margaret took that picture for me. But there are several pieces, a 17-mile stretch there near Fort Smith, but there's several stretches of the Butterfield route that still exist as gravel roads. But on most of them, it's been turned to asphalt. And but the road was used and is still being used. That route is still being used. A few months after the Butterfield Overland Mail route started, the Arkansas River rose enough that on 4 occasions, and only 4, John Butterfield was able to fulfill his original dream of carrying the overland mail from Fort Smith all the way to Memphis on 4 occasions. On 80 additional occasions, the water was too low between Fort Smith and Little Rock, but it was high enough between Little Rock and Memphis. So on 80 occasions, the mail was carried from Little Rock by steamboat to Memphis. And those dates are recorded in the Arkansas Gazette in their weekly steamboat register. And so during the 130 weeks of the Overland Mail's operation, the home stations received 4 stagecoaches every week, so about 520 times a stagecoach would pull up to each of the stations selected across the country. Senator Bozeman had been pushing for years to get the Butterfield declared a National Historic Trail, and that somehow passed in December and was signed by the President, and we'll see what that means. It may end up meaning little. Hopefully it will mean a lot. Hopefully it'll be easier to get grants. Hopefully signage will be improved. Hopefully some of the existing sites will be able to be restored and be more accessible to folks to follow that trail across the country. An official schedule was drawn up with hours to the minute to be at each of the stations. Teams of 4 to 6 horses were used to pull the stagecoaches, but in more difficult sections of the route, mules were used. Not only were there two beasts of burden, but there were two different kinds of stages used. There was a stagecoach like this one, and Gerald has written a great deal about these. They were the Concord mail coaches, constructed in Concord, New Hampshire. They were made of hickory with russet leather interiors, cushions, and side curtains. Some of the coach bodies were red, others were bottle green. The undercarriages were usually yellow and striped in black or brown. There were two lamps on the inside. There were two other candle lamps up by the driver, and the coach could carry about 4,000 pounds, including 9 to 12 passengers, and up to maybe 500 pounds of mail. In rougher sections of Arkansas and in Oklahoma and Arizona and Texas, a lighter weight stage was used called a celerity wagon. The interior was similar, but the top, instead of being hard, it was canvas. And so no mail, no luggage, no passengers could be on the roof. This is the only surviving photograph of an actual stage or wagon used by the Butterfield Overland Mail. All the other photographs you see are other stage lines or movie props that were made. I understand John Butterfield also purchased a number of water wagons for use in this part of the country to carry water to the stations to be put in cisterns. Every conductor had a horn that you heard Doug blow a few moments ago. They would shout all aboard and blow the horn, and that meant you better get on board or you're going to be left behind. Also, the horn would be blown 2 or 3 miles from a station to let the folks know, get the horses ready, we're going to be there in a few moments, and you just have 10 minutes to put on fresh horses and to grease the axles. I also understand that the mail coaches kind of had priority, or at least assumed priority on the trail, and if there was someone in front, it wasn't unusual for the horn to be blown to basically mean, move over, we are coming through. A passenger in 1859 wrote this about the post horn. You may not have seen what Doug was blowing. Many of them were curved like this, some were straight. But a passenger in 1859 wrote, "The blast of the stage horn, as it rolls through the valleys and over the prairies of the West, cheers and gladdens the heart of the pioneer. As it sounds through the valleys, it sends a thrill of delight. He knows that it brings tidings, mail, from hearts and homes he left behind him. It binds him stronger and firmer to his beloved country. So regular is its arrival that the inhabitants know almost the hour and the minute when the welcome sound of the post horn will reach them. The Overland is the most popular institution in the far West," he wrote. Now, not only were there two kinds of stages, there were two kinds of stations. Every 17 miles on average, the stage would pull into a rustic swing station. 10 minutes to change horses and to grease the axles. In about every 60 miles, the station would pull into a home station. Passengers didn't have 10 minutes, they might have as much as 40 minutes to not only get fresh horses, but take advantage of the facilities, I could put it that way, and to get a bite to eat. The old driver and the old conductor would change. There'd be a new driver and a new conductor, and that old driver and conductor would spend a night or two at the station and would catch the next stage going back in the opposite direction. So the same driver and conductor would repeat this same route over and over again so that the employees and the horses would know that route well enough to run that route even in the dark. There's been a great deal written about the route from St. Louis to San Francisco, almost to the exclusion entirely of Fort Smith to Memphis. And so tonight I want to spend my time primarily looking at Fort Smith to Memphis. In many books about the Overland Mail, it'll simply say, and the mail was also carried to Memphis, but the route is unknown. That's about all you would see. The stage would leave Memphis every Monday and Thursday at 8 o'clock. 91 hours later, would arrive in Fort Smith every Friday and Monday about 3:30 in the morning. On this 1852 map of Arkansas, I've labeled 20 Butterfield stations across the middle of the state, and have a map very similar to this on the table out in the lobby. According to the 1858 newspapers, I discovered that the headquarters in Memphis was at the Commercial Hotel on Front and Jefferson Streets, and D.F. Candy was the Butterfield agent there. On September 16, 1858, the only passenger on the very first trip out of Memphis was R.M. Brummer. The mail pouch left the Commercial Hotel, crossed the Mississippi by ferry, and arrived in Hopefield, Arkansas at the train station. On top of this 1858 map by E.W. Rucker, it shows the location of the Commercial Hotel, it shows the location of the Butterfield offices, it shows the location of the Memphis Post Office. The place where the ferry crossed came from a May 4th, 1862 map in the New York Times. And so after crossing the Mississippi River by ferry, arriving in Hopefield, the mail bags and passengers boarded a train for a short 24-mile trip to the end of the tracks. This 1822 map of Arkansas correctly shows that side of Arkansas is labeled the Great Swamp. And it really was. We've already talked about the trestles that had to be used for the train. And this is in Madison where the tracks ended, and this was the end of the tracks until well after the Civil War. So September 17, 1858, the Des Arc newspaper records that the Overland Mail was transferred from the train to what it called a light vehicle to transverse the muddy roads between Madison and Des Arc. I don't know what a light vehicle is. Might it have been a celerity wagon? Probably not. Perhaps it was a farm wagon, either open or maybe with a canvas top. But anyway, a light vehicle is how the newspaper described it, till it got to Des Arc, where it was transferred to a 4-horse stagecoach. And the roads from the end of the track to Des Arc, they were horrible. This is a period photograph of a wagon and horses literally up to their knees in mud. It was a very rough stretch of the road, and this is in large part the reason that this part of the route was often behind schedule, was simply from road conditions and the rain and the mud. Des Arc is almost 50 miles from Madison, and so most likely the light vehicle stopped south of Oakland and again south of Cotton Plant for a change of horses. 14 hours later, after leaving Memphis, the stage, the light wagon, arrived in Des Arc to the Jackson House. And here it switched to that 4-horse mail stagecoach that we are most familiar with. In Des Arc, the home station was at the Jackson House, and discovered this photograph of the Jackson House. Sad to say, it was torn down about 11 years ago. The house was 45 by 16 feet and had the dining room was 45 by 16 feet and had a 16 by 16 foot side building that the Butterfield stage office was in. Leaving Des Arc, the stage headed west 26 miles to the Atlanta Hotel in Oakland Grove, and most likely there was a swing station halfway at Hickory Plain for a change of horses. And this is a segment of the old military road that exists just outside of Oakland Grove. The hotel there at Oakland Grove had 6 guest rooms, Masonic Lodge on the 2nd floor, and the community had 150 residents, 3 dry goods stores, 2 boot and shoe makers, a harness shop, tailor shop, sawmill, grist mill, a school, and of course a brass band. Leaving the Atlanta Hotel, the stage headed west past Otto's Great House. This is an actual photograph of Otto's Great House taken in 1960, and right after this photograph was taken, the building was dismantled and reconstructed on the Faulkner County Museum grounds there in my hometown in Conway, Arkansas. Leaving Otto's Great House, the Butterfield stage headed south across the Arkansas River Ferry at Argenta to Little Rock. And the home station was at the Anthony Hotel, marked there with the arrow. And I found that photograph of the Anthony Hotel at the State Archives. From the Anthony House, the stage went back to the ferry across the Arkansas River and headed into Faulkner County, where I live. The stage came up the old military road, past Severe's Tavern, and this is a 1930 photograph of the remains of Severe Tavern and August Harchey's Tavern. Then across Donald Ridge, where I lived for a few years, and passing Gay Tavern, where my grandchildren went to school, and then on to the Cadron Ferry, where the stage returned to the original route across the state of Arkansas. From Cadron Ferry, Plummer Station. Samuel Plummer, his photograph is here, was a station agent, and he also had a leather shop next to the station. As you can see in this photograph that my wife and I took last December, a year ago, Samuel Plummer's station and leather shop were still standing, but they were in great need of repair. The only buildings still standing in Arkansas that were used by Butterfield Overland Mail Company are this, Plummer Station, what remains of it, Pot Station, which I'll show you in just a few moments, and the stone barn at Springdale Fitzgerald Station. It was a stone barn that Butterfield used. I'm sad to report that 4 weeks ago I took this photograph of Plummer Station, and the station had fallen in. The leather shop is still standing, but the roof of Plummer Station has collapsed. Leaving Plummer Station, the Butterfield stage next stop was my wife's hometown at Lewisburg, and shown here in this painting preserved at the Railroad Museum there. Leaving Lewisburg, the Butterfield station passed the post office at Hurricane, and these are the remnants of that station at Hurricane. And then 9 miles west of the Hurricane post office was this larger home station known as Potts Inn, with Kirkbride Potts as the station master and postmaster. Pot Station is the only restored Butterfield used building in Arkansas, and we're fortunate to have the director and the tour guide from Pot Station, wave your hand here, there you are here with us this week. At larger home stations like Potts Inn and Gala Creek, of course, a fresh team of horses were provided. The axles were greased and the passengers could disembark for a bite to eat. The driver and the conductor would get to spend a few nights at this wonderful home to catch the next stage in the opposite direction. And the meals at Potts Inn were hot cakes and cornbread, biscuits, pork, fish, or wild game, beans, bread, butter, sweet milk, and coffee. Quite a spread was put on at Potts Inn. The passengers were greeted in the parlor, and this is the parlor as you see it today at Pot Station. And upstairs was, there were 4 beds, a 4-bed bedroom, where passengers who wished to disembark and spend a night or two in hopes of catching an empty seat on the next stage to continue their journey. West of Pot Station, I discovered this 1827 map of the Dardanelle Ferry. This shows the old military road coming to the Dardanelle Ferry, the Indian agent's home, where the military road crossed the Arkansas River, and also shows the council tree that still stands there in Dardanelle. Leaving the Dardanelle Ferry and station and heading west, the station would come to Stinnett Station. There's a historical marker there on Highway 22. And this is a picture of Nancy Stinnett. She was about 8 years old when the Butterfield stage started stopping at her aunt and uncle's home. West of Stinnett Station, the stage most likely stopped at Shoal Creek for a change of horses and for the axles to be greased. from Shoal Creek, stop at Creole Station, and 20 years later, a Benedictine Abbey was built right near the Shoal Creek, near the Creole Station. West of the Creole Station, the Butterfield stopped for a change of horses at Moffett Station, near the site shown here. And then west of Moffett Station, stopped at A.J. Singleton Station for a change of horses. And I found this photograph of the A.J. Singleton Butterfield Station preserved at the Charleston Public Library. I also have a picture of the other side of the house too, but it looks as bad as the front. West of Charleston, the stage stopped at Oak Bower, where the Strang Station was located. There was a hand-dug well there that still survives. Visiting with Paul Strang, he told me that in 1954, an old wooden trading post building was still standing across the street. 16 miles from Strang Station, finally arrived at the metropolis of Fort Smith, City Hotel, the great junction point for the St. Louis and the Memphis stage. And Butterfield stables were located behind the City Hotel. The Conklins had a map they drew of Fort Smith and shows the City Hotel on 2nd and Garrison Avenue, very close to the river. In September of 1860, September 25th, there was a horrible fire in downtown Fort Smith. The City Hotel was lost along with Klein's drugstore, and the Butterfield offices moved a block away to the St. Charles Hotel. In 1921, I took this photograph of the empty lot where the City Hotel once stood, and stables holding dozens and dozens of horses and a half dozen spare stagecoaches or celerity wagons were located just behind the hotel. One passenger in November 26, 1856, wrote about the City Hotel. The stage stops at the City Hotel, where most of the persons connected with the Overland Mail are boarded. On landing at this comfortable abode, I was most kindly welcomed by Mr. J.K. McKenzie, the proprietor. Californians could not well fall into better hands, enjoy more pleasant quarters, or obtain choicer fare than they will find here at the City Hotel. Just outside of Fort Smith is Van Buren and the Arkansas River. This is the oldest photograph from 1860 of that river crossing. And in September of 1858, Waterman Ormsby, a passenger on the first stage, he described the ferry there much resembling a flat boat resembling a raft, something like this. But not long after, in July of 1860, William Tallock described a different ferry, a high-tech ferry. He described it, in the evening, we crossed the Arkansas River on a ferry propelled by 2 horses, walking round sort of a treadmill or nearly horizontal wheel that communicated motion to the paddles. This kind of locomotive power we have not previously met with, nor did we see any recurrence of it subsequently. I discovered this sketch in the National Geographic of a very similar ferry up in New York. Amazing technology there at the Van Buren-Fort Smith crossing. According to the Van Buren's Press Argus, this high-tech ferry was seized and burned by General Blount when he marched his troops into Van Buren after the Battle of Prairie Grove in 1862. Well, we've now completed our 91 hours across the state of Arkansas. We've arrived in Fort Smith, 2 o'clock in the morning. We've beat the St. Louis stage by 15 minutes. And this sketch was drawn of the stage with Butterfield's son as the driver, leaving Fort Smith, headed into Susan Drago's country, Indian Territory, and on into Texas. Now to answer some common questions. How fast did they travel? 4 or 5 miles an hour. They completed the 3,000-mile trip 21 to 23 days. On smooth portions of the road, maybe they would hit 12 miles an hour. But mud or deep sand, no. Very, very slow travel. Ralph Plumley, who traveled on the Butterfield line west of Tucson, he had a ticket to Tucson, he wrote, "The coach was fitted with 3 seats, and these were occupied by 9 passengers. As the occupants of the front and middle seats faced each other, it was necessary for these 6 people to interlock their knees, much as these fingers are interlocked." Ralph Plumley continued, "And there being room inside for only 10 of the 12 legs, each side of the coach was graced by a foot now dangling near the wheel, trying to find in vain a place of support. An unusually heavy male in the boot, weighing down the rear, kept those of us in the front seat constantly bent forward. He wrote the fatigue of uninterrupted traveling day and night in a crowded coach and in the most uncomfortable of positions was becoming to tell seriously upon all of the passengers and was producing in me a condition bordering on insanity. All of the passengers rode with baggage on their lap or mail under their feet. They traveled day and night, no more than just brief stops at the stations. They suffered from continual heat and choking dust in the summer and intense cold and occasional snow, even here in Arizona in the winter, as some of us discovered the other morning. Up to 3 additional passengers could ride on the top or on the back. In fact, I read of one story in the papers out of California. The stage was full. It was booked for the next several stages. There was a waiting list to get on the stage. One passenger bought a ticket to ride in the boot all the way to St. Louis. My goodness. One passenger wrote, "Were I to travel the road again, I would take 1 pair of large warm blankets, a revolver or shotgun, the stoutest suit I could get, with a strong, loose pair of boots. Some cans of preserved fruit would prove a great luxury on the route." These crowded conditions caused some of the passengers, as I mentioned earlier, to get off at a station in hopes of getting a little bit of rest and maybe finding an empty seat on the next stage. Restroom facilities, they were about the same as you had yesterday and today on your road trip, the nearest bush. But at Pot Station, an 8-seat outhouse. So all the passengers could find relief quickly and then get a good bite to eat. Ralph Plumley, on departing St. Louis, October 8, 1860, wrote, "I bought my ticket from Syracuse to Tucson. I secured a back seat in the overland coach, but the arrival of a woman and her brother obliged me to take the front seat. The unusually heavy male in the boot, weighing down the rear, kept those of us who were on the front seat constantly leaning forward, thus taking away all the support for our backs. My immediate neighbor was a tall Missourian with his wife and 2 young daughters. The man was a border bully, armed with a revolver, knife, and rifle. The woman, a very hag, ever following the disgusting habit of dipping snuff, filled the air and her clothing with snuff spittle. Her girls, for several days, overcome by seasickness and their vomiting, had no regard for the clothing of their neighbors." Wow, all the way to Tucson. If the stage was stuck in the mud or deep sand, passengers were expected to get out and help the stage get out of the mud. In extreme heat, to give the horses a rest, passengers might be asked to walk behind the stage. In 1857, you've heard this quote from Waterman Ormsby on completing the journey, "I now know what hell is like. I've just had 24 days of it." We do have a bit of a passenger's report from when they left Potts Inn and headed to the Dardanelle ferry. We don't have any passenger's report of Potts Inn, but when they left Potts Inn, they wrote, "When we reached the Dardanelles," is that, 9 miles away? from you. When we reached the Dardanelles, it was late at night and raining in an old-fashioned way. We were most unceremoniously turned out of the coach by the driver and delivered into the charge of the ferryman, who took the mail bags on his shoulder and his lantern in hand and told us to follow up to his boat at the ferry landing about a mile distant up the river. Placing our blankets on our back and valise in hand, the passengers proceeded to accompany him through a torrent of rain. We all got soaking wet by the time we reached the coach on the opposite bank, and 3 of our party were considerably used up the next day from the effects of the drenching. Ticket, $200. That was a lot of money. In 1858, you could feed your entire family for a year for $200. You had to work about 220 days to purchase that $200 ticket because normal wages were 90 cents a day. And I suspect those were probably 12-hour days, not 8-hour days with an hour break for lunch. Why did this wonderful, longest stagecoach mail route come to an end? For the most part, the Civil War. Confederates in Texas had a bad habit of kidnapping the stage wagons to use for the Confederacy. And so in March of 1861, the Postmaster General ended the southern route, but didn't end Butterfield's contract. The Overland Mail was assigned a new route to complete their contract. The new route was entirely in Union territory, avoiding Texas and Arkansas and the Confederate States entirely. The Overland Mail retained the red portion of the route shown here. They subcontracted the blue portion of the route to the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company. The contract also made the Butterfield responsible for the Pony Express. And so they took over the Pony Express, but subcontracted it to the Central Overland California and Pikes Peak Express Company to carry the Pony Express. It appears that the same stations, swing station and home stations, were used for the Pony Express and the stagecoaches. At least that's what I'm hearing from my recent visit up to stations along the Pony Express route. Interesting comment from the Arkansas newspapers of 1860. No one who has not traveled over the Overland Mail can form any just idea of the magnitude of this successful enterprise and the complete system necessary to its permanent establishment as a means of communication between the eastern states and the Pacific. Indeed, I am convinced that it is one of the greatest achievements as a coach mail line that the world has ever seen, he wrote. Considering the extreme length of the line, the character of the country through which it passes, and the immense distance necessary to transport food for the stock, and the additional fact that the whole time of its existence, only 3 mail failures have occurred on the line, and those failures were produced by high water. Now, Butterfield produced several hundred log books, ledger books, leather bound, for the employees to keep track of passengers and arrivals and departures. If you come across one of those, call Gerald or Doug before you go to sleep, because none of them have survived except one at the Smithsonian. We would love to get a hold of them. We would love to find passenger lists. We're just hungry for those details, but those log books, they have vanished. They have simply vanished. Outside in the lobby, tomorrow morning, I think my wife already took it to our trailer, I'll have a notebook filled with envelopes that were carried on the Butterfield stage, and you might want to take a look at some of those. Some went the Memphis route and some went on the St. Louis route, but they all came here through Arizona on their way to San Francisco. Anyway, thank you for your time and allowing me to share with you a little bit about the Butterfield stage through Arkansas. Thank you, Doug.